All right. Well, without further ado, thank you very much to everyone who has joined us tonight. Hello and welcome. I am very happy that you came here tonight. I would like to acknowledge that I live in the Likura First Nations traditional territory, which includes the Wiwekam and Wiwekai First Nation, as well as Kwikwa people. As a descendant of white settlers, I am honored to be involved in stewardship projects on this land that the First Nations people have stewarded since time immemorial. And for those of you joining us from other regions, it would be fabulous if you could share in the chat the names of the First Nations peoples' territories where you live. My name is Sandra Milligan, and I am president of Greenways Land Trust, one of the sponsors for the event tonight. Also from Greenways, we have Lydia Stratman, our communications and outreach coordinator, Erica Anderson from the museum at Campbell River, and we would like to thank also the UVic Speakers Series, who joined us with Trevor and supports this program. Some housekeeping details. Please do feel free to use the chat function. I find that's one of the benefits of an online webinar like this, that sometimes the conversations that you have outside of the presentation are as interesting as the presentation itself. So do feel free to share your thoughts as we listen to Trevor tonight. I will keep a note of any questions you ask. So if you say, question for Trevor, I will take a note of those as we go through the evening. And when Trevor's finished speaking, we'll come back to those questions that you have. So this evening is part of the Environmental Speakers Series, which is part of our Art and Earth Festival. The festival format for this year is to have multiple events throughout the year, virtual obviously for now, but hopefully in the not too distant future, we will find ourselves in the same room together. The festival allows us to engage in reflection on the connection between art and the environment. Tonight, I am very honored to introduce to you Dr. Trevor Hancock, who will be talking in part about the human side of an ecological concept that I believe to be one of the most important environmental issues of all, this concept of ecological footprint. And you can see it represented behind me in this drawing. And the concept is that each person's lifestyle requires use of a certain amount of our Earth's surface. This calculation of ecological footprint shows that in developed nations, like in Canada and the US, people have a lifestyle that greatly exceeds our planet's ability to sustain it. We can live like this on the backs of people in poorer nations who use a much smaller fraction of the world's resources. As such, they experience significant health inequity. Now, I was introduced to this concept about 15 years ago, and it impacted me profoundly. Since then, as an instructor in university biology, in every course, I have students do an assignment where they complete their personal footprint calculator. I believe the discussion we have and the information they gain from that activity is probably the single most important thing they learn and take away from a university biology course. Now, here with us tonight is Dr. Hancock, an internationally recognized public health physician and University of Victoria Emeritus Professor, who will help us learn about the human side of this concept. How can we create communities that both help us reduce our environmental impact while still supporting human health? And these can sometimes be conflicting and sometimes be symbiotic. 35 years ago, Dr. Hancock co-founded the now global Healthy Cities and Community Initiative that was quickly adopted by the World Health Organization and sparked healthy cities programs around the world. He co-founded both the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment and the Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare, phrase that's really wonderful. He was a member of the Canadian Council on the Social Determinants of Health, and Vice President of the Board of BC Healthy Communities. Locally in Campbell River, we benefited from that last program, which funded the directional signage that you see in our beaver lodge lands today. So that was an active communities funded program. More recently, straight out of retirement, Dr. Hancock established a new Victoria-based nonprofit called Conversations for a One Planet Region. In recognition of the work he's accomplished, Dr. Hancock received an honorary fellowship from the UK's Faculty of Provincial Health and was recognized by the Canadian Public Health Association with the DeVries Medal, the association's highest honor. And this is just a truncated list of his accomplishments. I could have had a whole other page, but I must include one more that is close to my heart, and that is Dr. Hancock was the first leader of the Green Party of Canada and the Green Party of Ontario. Now, some of you might be wondering, what about the arts part of this Arts and Earth Festival? And well, I can tell you, Dr. Hancock has also been a semi-professional nature photographer and is a Morris dancer and singer. His own words best describe this connection between art and earth. Ecology is the science of nature, while human ecology, a field that includes public health, is about the science and art of our connection to nature. This is where the arts come into the picture. One vitally important way in which we can create the sense of oneness with the earth is through artistic and creative endeavor. We need experiences that tap into our heart and our souls and not just our heads. And so I'm very honored tonight to welcome Dr. Hancock to our Campbell River community to share his thoughts on the earth. Thank you, Dr. Hancock.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sandra. And thank you also to Lydia for setting this up. And I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with you. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll share in just a minute. And I'm glad Sandra touched on the art side of it. There's not a lot of the arts piece in here, although I end with something at the end that might be interesting. But I'm actually very interested in the whole relationship between arts and nature and health. And how we bring those together. And I've thought about organizing what you already have, which is an arts and nature festival, or arts and earth in your case. So that might be something we end up talking about. But I'm just going to share my screen, and I'll warn you now, my computer's a little overloaded, so it takes a moment or two to think about whether it wants to do this. So if your screen goes blank, don't worry. We just tested it and it did work. So unless something's changed, we should be okay. Okay, there we are. Can you all see that? I'm assuming so. So my title is Healthy Communities 2.0. So Sandra mentioned that 35 years ago, I helped to start the Global Healthy Cities and Healthy Communities movement. And for years, what we had, in fact, for decades really, was we'd often find there'd be a healthy city program in a city, but there'd also be a green city or sustainable city program. And they tended not to talk to each other very much, which was kind of ridiculous. So one of my ambitions over the years has been to bring these two together. And the notion of a one planet region is one of the ways I've found, probably the best way I've found to do that. And so I call it Healthy Communities 2.0. And hopefully this is going to change. There we go. So this is what I'm going to talk about. The slide set itself is longer than what you'll see on screen. I've hidden a bunch of slides, but if you want the whole PowerPoint, you can have it. Lydia has it. It's about 20 megabytes and you can take a look at everything. I'm going to outline the problem, which actually Sandra's already done for me, so I will skip through that quite quickly. Talk about the notion of the Anthropocene, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and then talk about some of the work that's going on locally with a project called One Planet Saanich, which is not us, but it's related to us, linked with us. And then our own work as Conversations for One Planet region. But I want to end with the importance of finding hope and seeking opportunities. So as Sandra said, you know the basic problem. The global ecological footprint exceeded the Earth's biocapacity. It's estimated around 1970, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this. Do note, however, that more than half of the footprint globally is carbon, and that's also true in Canada. It's about 50 or 60%. So the problem is really very simple. In Canada, we act as if we had this 4.75 Earths. And that's the National Footprint Accounts from 2016. The data's 2016, the report was 2019. And of course, as we all know, sorry, just to say that here locally in Victoria and Saanich, the Jenny Moore at BCIT has actually done the ecological footprint for both Saanich and Victoria. She did her doctoral degree with Bill Rees at UBC and developed this idea, this approach of doing the ecological footprint sort of from a household level up, or household expenditure based. The footprint here is at least 3, more like 4. It's not, you know, quite the same answer. And of course, probably because we have a more temperate climate here and 90% of our electricity is hydro. So we don't have such a big carbon footprint. And of course, in reality, what we actually have is this, hence the notion of one planet. And as Sandra said, this is a global as well as a local equity issue. So we are using far more than our fair share of the Earth's biocapacity and resources. And so I think the fundamental challenge of the 21st century is, how do we do this? How do we live equitably and in harmony with each other and with nature and in good health on this one small planet that is our home? And so that is the challenge that we are trying to address locally. I don't think that we're going to tackle this from the top down. I think it has to be a bottom-up process. So many of you may have seen this video. I'm not going to show the video, but if you haven't seen it, just Google "Welcome to the Anthropocene" YouTube and you'll find it. It's about 8 years old now, but it's a very good 4-minute summary of the Anthropocene. I think it's really important in thinking about this term, the Anthropocene, to realize that it's 3 different things. Technically, it's a geological phenomenon. It's a new geological epoch. And based on the laying down of a new set of strata, of layers that will mark human presence, hence the Anthropocene. But those layers really represent an ecological phenomenon, which is the massive and rapid global ecological changes that are happening. And of course, they in turn represent a human phenomenon. We are the anthropos in the Anthropocene. We are, as a species, humanity as a whole, but particularly the high income countries, of course, creating these massive and rapid global ecological changes. And you know what they are. One of the things I always like to stress is this isn't just climate change. This is actually much more than climate change. So it's dealing with all these other issues you see here, pollution and ecotoxicity, species extinctions. All of these are together what constitutes the Anthropocene. And of course, they're all happening at the same time. And so this constitutes what many people are beginning to see as an existential threat or an existential challenge, that the question is beginning to be asked of whether societies will be able to continue, certainly won't be able to continue as they are. Are they going to collapse? Are they going to transition? Are they going to transform? Are they going to decline? But they're not going to stay the way they are. And if, of course, they decline and collapse, then that is an existential threat. And we don't have to end up there, but we certainly could. You know all about climate change. I'm not going to bang on about climate change. These are just some of the signs of climate change. And it is typified by climate change, but it is both the scale and the rapidity of change that matters. And so, yes, it's happening at a global scale. And so we have the notion of crossing planetary boundaries. And this is from the paper by Stefan et al. About 6 years ago now. And this was the second version of the paper, actually, revised version, updated at that point. But as you can see here, for 9 different Earth systems, some of which are sort of doubled up. So biosphere integrity has 2 components, so do biogeochemical flows at the bottom. But for these 9 systems, we are already past an expected or estimated planetary boundary for phosphorus and nitrogen flows and for extinctions per million species. We are in the yellow zone of uncertainty and increasing risk for land system change and climate change. For 2 or 3 of these areas, we simply don't know what the boundary might be. Novel entities, explained at the top right there, is persistent organic pollutants, heavy metals, nanoparticles, which I would add are not present in the ecological footprint. So the ecological footprint calculation in itself doesn't include these novel entities because there's no way to translate them into a measure of land. So we are approaching and in some cases crossing planetary boundaries that we should not cross. And we know that this is driven by 3 powerful forces. Now, I was born in 1948. And so since roughly the time of my birth, the global economy in constant dollars has grown 11-fold. The global population has grown 3-fold. And of course, our technology has massively expanded in terms of its, not just its power, but its ubiquity. The fact that all of us carry a body burden of persistent organic pollutants, as do the food chains from which we get those persistent organic pollutants, as do all those other species, that in itself is an indication of the power of our technology. And of course, it's happened incredibly rapidly. So on the left there, you have some of the driving forces, the socioeconomic trends. This is the great acceleration that is, again, a different paper from Stefan et al. Out of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. And so we have the sort of the hockey stick graphs on the left for, in this case, a dozen different main socioeconomic drivers. You can see top center real GDP, for example. The red arrows all indicate 1950. And you can see how dramatic the expansion has been in many of these areas since 1950. And on the right, you can see the growing toll on some key Earth systems, many of which were in the previous diagram. Note, incidentally, that there's not a lot of impact on domesticated land, bottom center, but that's really because there's not much land left for us to bring under the plow. So we've probably about reached all we can there. And of course, this in turn is decimating vertebrates, and many of you will be familiar with the Living Planet Index, which is a count of 4,300 different species, 20,000 different populations of those 4,000 species. And it's declined 68% up to 2016, note. So this is 5-year-old data by now. And that's since 1970. So we're having a massive toll. This isn't news to you. Arguably, and from a public health point of view, where I operate from, this is the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. When you combine that with the threat of inequality, and a WHO commission 12 years ago now reported that inequality is killing people on a massive scale, you combine the inequality and the Anthropocene, and you have a couple of massive and interacting global threats. So this is from the International Panel on Biosphere Ecosystem Integrity that reported a couple of years ago now. We are eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide. So I've spent a good chunk of the last, well, actually going back 30 or more years, but particularly the last 10 years, talking to the public health world, in particular the health world in general, about the fact that these ecological changes are a massive threat to the health of populations, both locally and globally. And that is because we now think of these as the ecological determinants of health. I led a Canadian Public Health Association report that reported 6 years ago now on what we call the ecological determinants of health. The very stuff of life we depend on ecosystems for air and water and food. All our food, all our fuel, all our materials, they all come from nature. And nature performs a bunch of other quote unquote services, not for us, of course, but we end up benefiting from them, including the relatively stable and livable climate that we seem to be bringing to an end. So these massive global ecological changes, the Anthropocene poses a massive threat to the health of our population. And so this was the two reports, or actually it's one report. On the right is we called it the report in brief. We had a 500-page background document that we haven't published because we never really fully completed it, but we extracted a 100-page summary, and from that a 30-page discussion paper for the Canadian Public Health Association, and they're available, quite easy to find online. At the same time that we were doing this, the Lancet had launched the notion of what it called planetary health, and this led to a global commission established jointly with the Rockefeller Foundation on planetary health. And you'll notice that the subtitle of their report is Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch. So they started to think about and write about and talk about this at the same time as we were doing our work. And one of the things they said in the report is, we have been mortgaging the health of future generations to realize economic and development gains in the present. So we are benefiting in terms of health from what we are doing to the planet, our social and economic development and what it's doing. But in doing that, we are damaging the health of future generations. So there is also a massive issue here of intergenerational inequity. So that's the big global picture. I'm sure it's not really news to you, but it's important that we start from there and that we understand this as we then start to talk about how do we do this. So if we're going to do this in Saanich, if we're going to become what we've called a one planet region or a one planet community to take only our fair share of the earth, we're going to have to reduce our ecological footprint by 70%. And that, of course, is a massive, massive challenge. For Canada as a whole, it's closer to 80%. So One Planet Saanich is not something I set up, but it is something that happened at the same time that we were setting up conversations for a One Planet region. And the municipality of Saanich took this on. And at the center, the guy in the vest and the yellow t-shirt is Colin Plant, who is a Saanich councillor, and next to him on the left, as we're looking at it, is Fred Haynes, who is the mayor of Saanich, and they are both of them invested in this, and Colin Plant is also the chair of the Capital Regional District, so that helps. And then the woman in the red jacket at the front there is Cora Holsworth, who is the consultant on this and works with One Earth. And so One Planet Saanich has been going roughly as long as we have, about 3 or 4 years now. And it came out of the work of Bioregional, which is a UK-based non-profit consultancy. And back in the early 2000s, they developed a set of One Planet Living principles. And you can see these here. This comes from their annual review in 2015. And they were in about 2018 or so, 19, were looking for 5 cities around the world to develop One Planet local actions. And one of them turned out to be Saanich. And so they started that, and we were starting One Planet conversations at the same time. And of course, we very quickly discovered each other and came together. The thing I want to stress here is this, that the top 3 principles that they have are not about the environment per se. They're about the outcome we want, which I would suggest is health and happiness, human development, call it what you will, the issues around equity and local economy, and issues around culture and community. So before you come to the fairly standard set of environmental issues, which are the other 7 principles, and note incidentally, they do not have housing and built environment per se in here, which I think is a bit of a mistake, but apart from that, I really like this set of principles, because one of the things they do that we really have to do is integrate the social and the ecological. So I'm a very big proponent of eco-social thinking, ecological and social thinking integrated. So One Planet Saanich operates with a bunch of supporters and stakeholders that include a community organic farm, a shopping mall, several schools, the South Island Prosperity Partnership, and so on. And so there's quite a collection of partners who are involved in this. One of the interesting things is this is the work that Jenny Moore and Coral Holsworth did in 2018. If you look at the ecological footprint based on household expenditure, and I should add, this does not include the impact of public expenditures. So federal, provincial, and municipal government expenditures are not included in this, except indirectly through taxes. But this is household expenditure based. Almost half the footprint is due to food. So food is a huge issue when it comes to reducing our footprint, followed by transportation, and then buildings, and then consumables. So these are the big 4 categories that One Planet Saanich and One Planet Living is focused on. And in their report, they also broke out what are the elements here. And interestingly, what you see is that roughly 3/4, almost 3/4 of our food footprint is due to meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. Almost 3/4 of our transportation footprint is due to private vehicles, and almost 3/4 of the building's footprint is due to operating energy. So if you want to figure out where do you get the biggest impact, the things we have to really address are our diet, our use of private vehicles, and the operating energy efficiency and design of our buildings. And so those are the areas where we can make the biggest wins in terms of the footprint. So some of the things that they then suggest as a result is we need to eliminate fossil fuel emissions, so oil and gas, in other words, for heating buildings. And we need to convert at least half of gasoline private vehicles to electric, reduce purchase of non-food consumables by 30%, so less stuff in our lives, reduce meat and dairy, and purchase 25% less food, because of course there's an astonishing amount of food waste. One estimate is that something like 60% of all the food in its passage from being grown to us eating and then disposing of it, 60% goes to waste, which is just staggering. So purchasing 25% less food would be good. Now, the good news is that in all of these, which I will come to in a while, or right now actually, there are many health co-benefits. And so I'm not going to go into those in detail, but they should be reasonably readily apparent. So if we look just at clean energy systems, for example, in industry and transportation and electricity generation, space heating, and so on, we know that if we reduce our use of fossil fuels, if we switch to clean energy systems, we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And climate change in and of itself is a health threat. And then we're also going to reduce air pollution emissions. And in fact, there's some interesting work that's been done looking at the reductions in air pollution in places like China and India in particular, as a result of COVID and the COVID pause. And the number of lives saved by reducing air pollution is at least equal to, if not greater than, the number of lives lost to COVID, at least in China. So these are significant health benefits, health co-benefits. Then we know there's all sorts of health co-benefits to a low meat diet. And I might point out here, I tend to stress a low meat diet rather than a vegetarian or vegan diet, well, partly because I'm not vegetarian or vegan myself, so I shouldn't preach what I don't do, but also because I don't think that a vegetarian diet is an easy sell in our society right now to the majority of the population. But I think a low meat diet is. We know that eating a low meat diet has all sorts of health benefits. We also know that if we ate less, remember the 25% reduction in food purchasing, smaller portions will reduce obesity. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of health co-benefits to active and public transportation help, hence the active transportation, active communities work of BC Healthy Communities, among many others. And we know that if we get people out of private vehicles, out of cars, onto public transport, or biking or walking, we end up with fewer injuries, we end up with increased physical activity, which incidentally translates into lower levels of obesity. And interestingly, we also have strengthened social connections. Public transit, Mayor John Sewell in Toronto back 20 or 30 years ago, described the Toronto transit system as the great democratizer, because we all had to learn to rub up with each other and get on together in those crowded subway cars. And he saw that as a democratic function, which is very interesting. If we reduce our consumption, we reduce our pollution and waste generation as well. And there's all sorts of health co-benefits to that. So there's no question in my mind that from a public health point of view, becoming a one planet region is good news. Now, I should add, and I don't think I go into it very much in this presentation, that we have to be very careful that it doesn't become bad news for disadvantaged groups within our communities. And that as we go through this, it has to be a socially just transition so that we don't just throw all the fossil fuel workers out of work and say tough. They have to have a transition strategy. So let me then just end by talking a bit about what we're doing as Conversations for a One Planet region, which is something that we started. It actually came out of some work I was doing at UVic before I retired. I set up a group called UVic in the Anthropocene to start to ask the question, what does this university do in response to this massive ecological and social and economic and cultural challenge of the Anthropocene? And we set up some local conversations that kind of took on a life of their own, and ultimately about 18 months ago became an NGO called Conversations for a One Planet region. And part of what inspires me, and this quote was from Will Steffen, about who I've mentioned before, about 15 months ago, December of 2019, he was talking about climate and planetary tipping points in an article, or in an interview about an article they just published on climate change tipping points. And he said this: we need to reach a social tipping point before we reach a planetary one. And so in many ways, the Conversations for a One Planet region, the work we do, is about that. Our mission and purpose is to establish and maintain conversations. In a nutshell, we need to be talking about this. We are talking about climate change somewhat, not enough, but we're not talking about this much bigger set of global ecological changes or what it means locally. And we are going to have to reach what Will Steffen here called a social tipping point before we reach a planetary one. So our vision is of a region that achieves social and ecological sustainability. Notice social sustainability. It brings with it implications of social justice and social equity. And we want high quality of life and a long life and good health for everyone, but within the equivalent of one planet's worth of biocapacity. And as I said, our mission is simply to establish and maintain the conversations. How do we get people, organizations, governments, businesses, you name it, faith communities, interesting enough, is an interesting place to have this. How do we get people talking about this issue and how we need to respond to it and how we're going to respond to it? So as you'll see at the bottom, our slogan, which is actually a bit hidden in this image, but you'll see it on all the other slides, our sort of slogan is learn, discuss, understand, imagine, design, create. So here I've spelled that out. First, we need to learn about this stuff. People don't know about it. We need to talk about it. We need to discuss it. We need to come to understand it. then we need to begin to imagine both what might happen if we do nothing or carry on as we are, and then what an alternative might look like. And once we can begin to imagine that, then we can begin to design it, and we can begin to create it, to build it. And it is about not just redesigning the built environment, it's about redesigning our social environment, our social context. It's about redesigning our economy. It's really about cultural change. We often say that we're in the business of cultural evolution. That's what we are really trying to achieve here. Because if we don't change some key values, then we're not going to be able to change anything else. So we're in the business of value change, and we've done some conversations last year based on these ideas of Jeremy Lent about the need for value change. And so we've talked about 3 core values that he sees we need to be talking about what it means to have a society based on quality of life, not on how much stuff you have. We need to be talking about our sense of shared humanity, not just with people in our community, but people on the other side of the world. And we need to be talking about the value we place on environmental sustainability, which brings with it notions of our responsibility to future generations and to other species. And so it's also about connections. It's our connections to other people, our connections to nature. And that's another strong theme that we emphasize. So this is our website. You can find us online. It's oneplanetconversations.ca. And the shot's a bit old. We've progressed our conversations. Our next conversation is actually tomorrow night. But our conversations at the moment are online, but we're very much focused, as soon as we can be, back to that, on face-to-face conversations, kitchen table conversations, discussions. How do we get people to talk about this in schools, in faith communities? So we want to expand our conversations to involve far more people than we do, geographically and demographically. How do we engage people of color? How do we engage Indigenous people? How do we engage with different faith communities? How do we engage with low-income populations? How do we engage with all of those? We want to deepen the conversation. And in fact, on Monday of this week, we started a pilot of our first participatory learning circle to dig into this. So a group of 12 people who will, over the next 6 weeks, once a week, spend a couple of hours in deep conversation about what this is all about. And if that works, which we think and hope it will, we want to expand that to more circles. And then we try and connect our conversation to others doing similar work. So this morning, for example, I was having a conversation with the executive director of the Community Social Planning Council, because she is interested in the social justice and social equity implications of a One Planet region. And also with the South Island Prosperity Partnership, who are interested in building a prosperous economy, but recognize it has to be a green economy. And so we want to actually do tomorrow's conversation for our local population, local people here, is on donut economics. And we are now planning a donut economics workshop for the region in May. And that's what our meeting was about. So those are the kind of connections we're trying to create. And that's very important. So some of these things I've already talked about. We've also talked about establishing a program of kitchen table conversations. Providing a little guidebook and having people sit down around their kitchen tables, literally and metaphorically, or at work tables at dinner or lunch or at school, and have these conversations. We've talked about bringing together people at a neighborhood level to do co-design charrettes. Imagine your neighborhood at some point in the future when it's a One Planet neighborhood. What does it look like? How do you get there? And so on. And I've already mentioned the participatory learning circles. Excuse me. And I just want to end with this, because I think this is really important. All of this is, not surprisingly, some sort of a bit of a downer, a bit bad news. although of course, I think the fact we're talking about it is the good news. I often liken this to, we have to, as a physician, I wouldn't advise you, or I wouldn't hide from you the fact that you had a serious disease. You have to name it, recognize it, and figure out how you're going to deal with it. And in a sense, that's where we're at. We're naming and recognizing this serious challenge. How do we deal with it? A couple of my colleagues in an article 7 years ago now, wrote that hope is the commitment to positivity in the face of adversity. And I committed myself to positivity for the last 30 or 40 years, but also recognizing, as Einstein said, that in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. And when I talk to young people in particular, I emphasize that opportunity. And I say, look, you know, the antidote to despair is hope. And there is reason to hope, all sorts of reasons. One is that moving this way to a more ecologically sustainable one planet society results in health gains. Secondly, and particularly this resonates with the public health audience, we've successfully helped to create major societal shifts before. Think about tobacco. 30 years ago, you'd walk into a room and there'd be ashtrays on the table and a lot of people would be smoking. We wouldn't dream of that happening now. Big cultural shift, in fact. Thirdly, we're not alone in this. We have many potential partners. And when you start to bring in faith communities, the business sector, who are the people who are creating the new economy, the social justice folks who are interested in socially just transitions, there's lots of new partners out there. Fourthly, and as someone who's been around this business for almost 50 years now, since the first UN Conference on the Environment in 1972 that I watched from afar, we knew then much of what I'm talking about, not in the detail we know now, but we basically had the outlines of all of this 50 years ago, and we knew what needed to be done 50 years ago. So it's not that we don't know what to do, we know what to do. So we don't have to go looking for it. We do have to just implement what we know. And of course, we have made progress. There are changes. And so we can point to all of those. So there are all sorts of reasons for hope. And the second thing is, as Naomi Klein said, and she was only talking about climate change, but if we took this as capitalism versus, if you like, the Anthropocene or global ecological change, this changes everything. This, in fact, changes everything. All of these indicators that I shared with you and talked about earlier. But as I say to young people, the fact that everything has to change presents endless opportunities. There's endless opportunities to do new things, to do old things in new ways, to do better things, to do different things. And the younger generation is going to be the one that has to reinvent almost everything. And that is, I think, an exciting challenge. It's an opportunity. And yes, we're going to need scientists and researchers and so on, but in reinventing the world, we also are going to need visionaries and revolutionaries and evolutionaries. We're going to need innovators and creators and thought leaders and communicators and cultural shifters. We're going to need civic and political activists. By cultural shifters, I mean artists and the arts community, as well as faith leaders and faith communities. They are cultural shifters potentially. And we're going to need new green and social entrepreneurs. How do we build an economy that that not only builds financial capital, but at the same time builds social and human and natural capital? And if we can't build all four forms of capital at the same time, then I tell business people, you're not real capitalists. Real capitalists build all four forms of capital at the same time. If you're not doing that, you're not a real capitalist. So we've got a bunch of fake capitalists at the moment running the corporate capitalist system. So while the Anthropocene poses daunting challenges, I firmly believe that it presents endless opportunities. And I think that's an important message to almost end on. But in talking with Lydia a couple of days ago, I also talked about the fact that in another part of my life, I am a green man. And I've been playing the green man in our Mama's Play here in Victoria for 15 years or more. And on the top left, that is me. And on the top right, you can see me standing amidst my fellow green men, or bogies as we call ourselves, at an annual festival called Jack in the Green in Hastings in England. And bottom there, you'll see the Jack itself is the tall leafy thing with a crown on it that we parade through the town for a whole day. And it's a big festival. My point is that there is an emotional and cultural element to this that we also need. This is a way of connecting to nature and to people. And so I applaud the fact that you do an Art and Earth Festival. I think we need Art and Earth Festivals everywhere. And I've been thinking about how do we bring a sort of Green Man or Jack in the Green type festival to this region as well. So although a lot of what I've dealt with is sort of head stuff, I also have a strong interest in, and I've written about the need for us to also deal with this in terms of heart, gut, and spirit stuff. And we need to be expressing it in these ways as well. And with that, I will stop and thank you for your time. And we have some time for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Trevor. That was just fabulous. We had a question from Ken Blackburn, just not very long ago, 5-10 minutes ago. You used the term donut economics. So Ken's asking to explain.
Okay. Kate Raworth is a development economist in Oxford now. She worked for Oxfam at one point, and she came up with this notion of donut economics. And it's really a very simple, but I think quite profound approach to economics. And it says, imagine a donut. So you've got a circle with a hole in the middle. The hole is what she calls the social foundation. So you have to have an economy that is big enough to ensure that everybody has their basic needs met: food, shelter, education, income, human rights, you name it. That costs money. So one reason that life expectancy is low in low-income countries, the main reason is they don't have enough income to ensure universal education, clean water, adequate housing for everybody. They're not wealthy enough as a nation to do that. And so you need a certain level of economic activity to ensure the social foundation. The outer layer of the donut, beyond that is that's what she calls the ecological ceiling. And so you can't exceed the one planet limitations of the planetary boundaries. And so she uses, in fact, around the outside, the planetary boundaries, and in the inside, largely the stuff that's in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the human dimension aspects of that. And so what she says is we need an economy that's within that sort of the bread part of the donut that is large enough to ensure the social foundation and yet small enough to not exceed the ecological ceiling. And that's the kind of economy we need. And she describes it as being both regenerative, in as much as it will have to regenerate nature, because we've so damaged nature, we actually need to, well, not sure whether we need to regenerate or we really need to kind of step back and let nature regenerate. But I think we also have to do repair of the damage we've done. But also it's both a regenerative economy and a distributive economy, because one of the key implications of what is in essence a steady state economy, it can't keep growing, is that if the pie isn't growing, and if you've got countries that have less economic development than they need, and other countries that have got way more than they need, you're going to have to redistribute. And you have to redistribute both globally and within our own local economies. And so it is both a regenerative and a distributive economy. She calls it a just and safe space for humanity, which echoes the language of the folks who do the planetary boundaries work. Does that help, Ken? Does that cover it?
Yeah, it does. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I guess the square, the circle that needs to be squared, however that goes, is that the inequity that has been built. I mean, we're going to talk globally, not just within our own region, but the inequity that's been built, has gotten to the point because of the fact, for example, Canada's growing or has built it upon 4 Earths, whereas a lot of the inequity that has grown for what we used to call like developing countries or third world countries have a much lower standard, probably because they've been growing within the one world and probably less than the one world. So as we attempt to scale down to reach one world, those other countries basically are saying, in many cases, that the environmental crisis has been built by you, and it's your problem. You're seeing a lot of belligerence out of China, for example, along that. Saying, well, don't tell us about the ozone layer. Your refrigeration did it, and they're scrambling just to build a refrigeration market. So we're scaling down while developing countries are scaling up. I suppose, sadly, because our so-called success is seen as a goal in development. So where do we start squaring that with, especially across cultural boundaries that really shift value structures? And
I wouldn't pretend it's easy. I mean, I've talked years ago in Singapore to a strategic policy group there, and also in Malaysia and so on. And it's not well received, understandably, if someone from a high income country comes along and says, you've got to be sustainable. And that's not the way to do it. I've been saying for some time, we have to move first and we have to move farthest. So if we don't show that we are reducing our ecological footprint, why the hell would they do anything? And we do have to, for example, clean technology transfer, things like that. So you don't want China or India or any other country to achieve an adequate economy using the same 19th century technologies that we used. So they have to leapfrog. And of course, they've done that. I mean, you look in Africa and they never went down the laying millions of miles of cable route for telephone systems. By and large, they went straight to wireless. In many parts, so they skipped a generation of technology, and so they should. So technology transfer, I think, is a piece of it. We have to set the example. We can't call on others to do what we're not doing ourselves. We need to I wouldn't say invest. We need to pay to rehabilitate the environments that have been damaged there in order to meet our needs here. So whether it's mining or any other extractive industry or ripping off their fisheries or whatever it is that high income countries have been doing, we in effect owe reparations, rather like after a war. So I think these are some of the things we have to talk about. And at the same time, you don't want middle income countries becoming high income countries in terms of their ecological impact. But you do want low income countries to become middle income countries, because right now they have less than they need. So it's a long, complicated conversation, but I think part of it is we have to show what we're willing to do starting right here, right now.
Yeah, I completely agree. The problem becomes further exacerbated when we get into the social and cultural sphere with, rising corruption, which is really a cancer on political systems and social systems. And, again, just another kind of hurdle. But yes, thanks for that.
And I like your comment there, Sandra, that action is the antidote to despair. I have stuff there around, I've got pictures in a different presentation around climate change and exactly that, what young people saying, this is the antidote. Sorry.
Well, it's a tough topic, you know, when I teach about ecological footprint and carrying capacity of the planet, the fact that we're, you know, by all accounts beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. When you're teaching university students, you know, I don't want them to go into the depths of despair. You know, you can't. You can't leave people in that
No.
sad place. You need to help them see what can be done. So I just wanted to draw people's attention to the chat. Dan shared an excellent resource there from Kate Raworth. And I think Erica has a question.
Well, it kind of ties into what you were saying, because like, again, I find you can get overburdened with the intellectual end of this discussion. And you mentioned specifically writing about the heart and the gut impacts of this discussion. Where would we find some of that, some of the work you've done on that?
That particular article, which was quite lengthy, was published in a journal called Challenges. So there's a very interesting group called In Vivo that brings together people interested in sort of ecological thinking and systems around health, but it's everything from people interested in the gut biome to people interested in planetary health. So it's a really interesting intellectual environment where you get this ferment of people coming from bacteriology to people coming from global Earth systems and talking to each other. So they publish a journal called Challenges. I'm pretty certain that I can send the link to Lydia, but I'm pretty certain that article is open access. It's lengthy and it goes into a lot of stuff. But essentially what I'm talking about is the heart stuff is how do we approach people emotionally, or how do we engage people emotionally? The gut stuff is just our instinct to, you know, oh, this is wrong, this is bad, and we just kind of feel or know that. And then the spirit stuff is, I think one of the fundamental issues underlying all of this is our disconnect from nature, which has been going on for a very long time. And so how do we reconnect to nature? And I think part of that means we have to reestablish a reverence for nature that we've lost. And I'm actually working with, there's a global working group for an international organization on health promotion that I'm part of, looking at, it's a global working group on planetary health, but it is led by and has a large membership from Maori and South Pacific Islanders. And they're very interested in both the indigenous traditions and the spiritual aspects of this. And so we've just written a couple of articles that'll be out later this year about this from a point of view of as health promoters, as public health people. How do you get public health people to actually talk about health, spirituality, and how do you engage with faith communities?
Well, and I think, like, to me, a big part of the discussion is people recognizing that quality of life is not reflected in your what you own and what you're like in material possessions. And it is I think a lot of the discussion with people here has to happen on a spiritual level of understanding that you can reduce your material possessions and your material wealth and still have that quality of life. I do want to say thanks for talking about the donut thing and explaining that too, because I was at the dentist the other day and the people in the chair next to me were talking about donut economics, and I wanted to sort of reach over and say, what is that? But they had stuff in my face and I couldn't say anything.
Places we learn things, huh?
Yeah.
So we're just coming to the end of our time, but I think I'll take advantage of my position here as MC to get one question in myself. And if anybody else has one, if you want to type something quickly into the chat. So reading William Rees, who was the originator of the ecological footprint, 1992, I read a more recent interview, and he said his interest now is shifted towards human psychology, and basically noting the fact that good psychological research shows that humans are basically self-delusional, you know, we all think we can be better tomorrow, that tomorrow we'll eat less, tomorrow we'll drink less, and you know, have a better quality of life and be a better person. We all have this optimism that we're going to be better, but of course tomorrow never comes. And so I know psychology I consider a very young science, but is there any hope that we're going to be able to figure out how to, I guess I would say the government's role is imperative and essential, because it's only with changes in policy that will force people to make the changes that we won't make ourselves, because it's too hard, because we're self-delusional.
I'm not sure I really buy that. I don't think government's going to lead on this. And I certainly don't think federal and provincial governments are. They're too invested in the current system and they get too much benefit from it. And that's true of the corporate, well, particularly the large corporations, of course. I think there are important lessons to be learned from the fight against tobacco. And it is no coincidence that the fossil fuel industry is working from the tobacco industry playbook. They are using the same techniques. There's quite a lot of literature written around this. They're using the same techniques, in some cases the same consultants, to sow doubt about climate science, to cultivate denial, to set up front organizations. All of these are things that the tobacco industry did. On the other side of it, we largely beat back the tobacco industry. If you, as I said earlier, 30 years ago, you'd walk into a room and there'd be ashtrays on the table and people smoking, and that was normal. Wouldn't dream of that happening today, and that's been the case for 10 or 15 years now. That's actually quite a big cultural shift, but it was not, by and large, led from the top. So what made a difference was local activists, groups like one of my hero groups is the Non-Smokers' Rights Association, and a guy called Gar Mahood, who basically took the view that your right to smoke stops at my nose and that I have a right. And so it turned it into a human rights issue. And that, I think, and that taps into issues of values and control and power and rights. And I think that's kind of the path we need to go down. And I don't think governments are going to lead. I think values start to shift and then governments start to shift. I think they follow. They don't set values. I think they follow values. And so we need to shift values. There's a guy here called Robert Gifford at UVic, who's an environmental psychologist, and he's written about the 7 dragons of denial. And those are worth looking at too, because we've done this before and we can do it again. But it is about shifting core values, and it is about, I think, community-led change. And if you look at what happened around tobacco, and actually what's happened around climate change, the governments that have got on board first and led have been municipal governments, and then provincial and federal governments come along after.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Hancock, for joining us tonight. It was a very interesting conversation, and I'm glad we had a chance to have some talk afterwards. And so thank you all for coming. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you next time. Lydia put in, if you scroll up in your chat, I think near the very top, you'll find the link for our next talk on April 20th, which is during Earth Week. So we all have something to look forward to motivate us towards a healthier planet.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And one of these days, I hope to make it up there.
That would be lovely.
Do it in person.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you and good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.